Welcome to Money Moves. I'm Samantha Lewis, an early stage venture investor at Mercury Fund, where I spend every day thinking about and exploring the intersection of traditional finance and the on-chain world. This show is about what happens when those two disparate systems converge. Throughout our episodes, we're going to explore what this convergence means, what it means for capital markets, for institutions, and for the global financial system. My co-hosts are two people who have spent their entire careers in two very different worlds, one in TradFi and one in crypto. Both of them are now using that expertise to build at the convergence of the two. I'm lucky enough to be the lead investor in both of their companies, and I sit on both of their boards. So my job as a VC and as this podcast host is to shine light on them. I'll be teeing up intellectually stimulating conversations and let these guys roll. The global financial system is getting an upgrade, and that's what this show is about. So there's a lot of narrative around de-dollarization and the geopolitical changing world order. Ian, break this down for us. Give us a little bit of history, what's been happening over the past few years to fuel this de-dollarization narrative, and why is it relevant to our blockchain world?
Okay, so I think we got to start at the very beginning. The United States has been the wealthiest country in the world for quite some time. It was pretty obvious after the Civil War and huge immigration to the United States that the U.S. would be an important economic power. Really came of age through the first world wars in Europe and the decolonialization, which came about as a function, or really, was made evident as a function of the world wars. And as the U.S. and the world emerged from those wars, the U.S. effectively funded European reconstruction and the global economic order. In return, what the U.S. got was quasi-open markets. They become more closed. I think that's a big reason that Donald Trump became president, but I digress. But quasi-open markets globally, and with that, markets to sell U.S. treasuries into. As U.S. sold more and more treasuries to fund more and more deficits, that aspect of the global order became more important. And so what had underpinned the dollar originally, coming out of those world orders, was gold. Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard because we were running very big deficits as a function of the Vietnam War. And it became harder and harder to maintain that gold standard. We then went on to a truly fiat system, but we had those markets open. Those markets that we'd funded through reconstruction post-World War II, those markets that became open as Asia came online, not just Japan, but Korea and other places in Asia, markets that became open everywhere. And so coming off of the gold standard, we had markets not only to sell into, but we also had markets to buy our treasuries. And the fact that those markets bought our treasuries supported the US dollar and led to dollar dominance. The key of those markets supporting the US dollar and that dollar dominance were the petrostates in the Gulf. They were running huge surpluses, selling oil at a time when the US was not running a petroleum surplus. The US now broadly runs an oil surplus. That would have sounded crazy to me when I was my children's age. And even crazier to my father, who lived through the oil embargoes and the oil spikes of the 70s. But the world has changed. So to recap, how did we get to here? The US, big economic dominant power now for quite some time, really came of age into the dollar system following World War II. Reconstruction and the opening up of quasi-open markets following World War II gave us a place to sell things into and a place for from which people to buy our treasuries. That worked really well. US grew really well. We got into some fiscal trouble with the Vietnam War and wanted to have more control over our monetary policy. Nixon took us off the gold standard. Then we still had those quasi markets to sell into. We had surpluses, especially in petro markets, coming off of the gold standard, and that has supported big dollarization globally and the support of the dollar regime now for a generation. But the world's changed. There's been a rise of other economic powers, notably China. The US has become more energy sufficient. And as we sit here today, there's a lot of talk about de-dollarization. I think what people mean when they say de-dollarization is they mean that there will be other reserve currencies other than the dollar for foreign sovereigns and large institutions to hold their money in, to hold their savings in. I think that's a big part of the conversation for today. And I will say there's more than one thing that drives dollarization. It's not just US economic dominance per se. Now China's the same size as the US economy, plus or minus, some measures bigger, some measures smaller, but let's call them roughly the same size for the purpose of this conversation. And so on first blush, people might say, well, okay, China would now be a place to store my excess savings if I'm a family office or a sovereign wealth fund or a pension fund. A lot of really smart people have said that to me. I am more skeptical. I believe that, well, to talk about de-dollarization, you need to talk about where else savings could go. So that's why I'm starting with China. So as we think about where money going into China, I'm more skeptical. I think America wears its problems on its sleeve, and it's a little bit harder to see China's problems for the outside. Having lived in China for 7 years, speaking the language, being familiar with the culture, I'm no shortage of impressed with what the Chinese have been able to do for the last generation, but they are far from perfect. They're certainly untested on the global stage when it comes to military or even geopolitical influence, and their macroeconomic recipe still rests upon a closed capital account. A closed capital account means you can't so easily get your money out of the country. You know, I'm skeptical that a country with a closed capital account can really run the reserve currency for the world. And so I'm skeptical that China will be this huge sucking sound driving de-dollarization. Europe's growth, so a second major economy, plus minus the size of the US, is Europe. Europe has struggled in economic policymaking. Europe certainly lacks the energy independence that's on full display here with the Strait of Hormuz. Europe is an aging society that's failed to really grab the reins of leadership in the last 25 years since the euro was founded. I think that the European economic area has largely been a disappointment to people looking from the outside, especially Americans who see economic dynamism as the goal of an economy. That's not how many in Europe view their economic goals. They view them as a more socialized standard of living. But I'm not sure that that's going to draw the savings to be a dollar competitor. Many people that are Bitcoin maxis who've looked around the world and said, none of these things look particularly great. Let's have Bitcoin as the reserve currency. And I think Bitcoin suffers in being a reserve currency in that it doesn't have a monopoly position as a currency. Namely, you can't pay taxes in Bitcoin. And so in the OECD, the government is 35 to 65% of the economy. If you have to pay that kind of government, that kind of economic participant in a currency, that currency is going to have dominance, if for no other reason than there's taxation. So de-dollarization is the idea that the dollar will become less dominant. For it to become less dominant, there needs to be a replacement reserve currency. I think China's capital account being closed and problems that are a little bit less easy to see and them being a little bit less tested on the global stage leads me to be as yet unconvinced on them as a rival. Europe's stagnant economic growth and reluctance to assume a leadership role leads me to be reluctant to say that they are going to rival the dollar. They've not done a great job since the adoption of the euro 25 years ago. Alternatives to the fiat system as a reserve currency. Obviously, Bitcoin is the most notable, and it lacks one of the key factors for currency dominance, which is its role in the government's aspect of the economy. So hopefully,
So it sounds like you don't buy in to the de-dollarization narrative.
I think we live in a world where there will be decentralization across society, across economies. And so that in and of itself will pull from the core out to the margin. Value will accrue more at the margin. Value will be more atomized. Savings will be more atomized. I believe in a story that becomes more decentralized. I believe in a story that will and as such, we probably come down from a very high level of dollar dominance, But true de-dollarization means that a big sovereign, a big family office, large corporations, when the shit hits the fan, see an alternative currency for their savings that they feel as confident in. No doubt there are petrostates with large dollar holdings who are wondering, should I feel as safe in my treasuries if the US is going to pull air bases out of the region? No doubt that is a question taking place today. But it does not necessarily mean that they want to keep their money in a currency, their savings in a currency that has no air bases in the region right now, like Europe or China, or one like Europe that has stagnant growth, or one like China that has a closed capital account. So maybe they own a bit more gold. Gold has become far more featured in sovereign holdings recently. Gold buying from sovereigns has gone up substantially. So I think you'll see some decentralization, some push to the margin, but a true de-dollarization means that there's got to be a replacement for it. And there are other things that underpin dollar dominance, namely global trade takes place for the most part in the dollar. Yes. Are some trades taking place in CNY now? Of course. Once again, closed capital account. The Russians tried to do trades with the Indians in oil. Russians sold Indians oil. Russians got Indian rupees. Russians didn't know what to do with the Indian rupees. This is just fact of nature. Is there a future state where China has a more open capital account and more liquid capital markets and more global capital? Yeah, but we're not in that state today. The other point that I would make, and I really would like to toss the ball to Dave, I would make one other point. Growth really matters in this context. The capital account matters, namely how much foreign investment comes into your country versus how much of your country's investment goes abroad. Right now, the U.S. economy may be on the tip of a huge acceleration as a function of technology. That will draw in foreign capital, and that will counterbalance whatever sales there are of treasuries as a function of U.S. rebalancing its geopolitical strategy. So if we pull a little bit, said practically, if we pull a little bit back from the Middle East, making our petrodollar cousins a little bit more nervous, so they're a little bit less willing to hold the marginal T-bill. But the U.S. economy is accelerating as a function of 1,000 AI bots massively growing GDP. Then for every dollar that's going to come out of a T-bill, there's somebody who's going to be looking at debt to GDP coming down as a function of GDP going up, and amazing U.S. companies to invest in, and those are denominated in dollars, as are the T-bills. And remember, if you buy Meta stock denominated in dollars, or you buy T-bills, you still bought dollars. It's the same dollar. As long as we have, if you look at what the market cap is of what's Nvidia's market cap these days? Rough justice changes every day by a couple $100 billion. Let's say a couple $1 trillion. Okay, well that's a couple $1 trillion of dollar holding. Now a lot of that's domestic, but a fair amount of it's private. It's non-negligible. So if the U.S. economy continues to grow with many $1 trillion companies absorbing global investment, that will be a factor in dollarization and offset some of the de-dollarization that may come from a shift in U.S. geostrategic positioning.
And why are we talking about this on a show about the intersection of crypto and financial markets? Because, and first of all, that was a really freaking good answer, Ian. I can tell you've been a macro trader. You've been thinking about this. You've been trading on this theory probably for the last few decades. And I agree with pretty much everything that you've said. The reason we're talking about it on this show is because the rise of cryptocurrency, which gave rise to stablecoins and tokenization, the impetus for that was someone or some group of people named Satoshi Nakamoto looked at the system that you're describing and said, well, you're right, the only alternative to fiat currency, which is the output of the modern nation state, right? A modern nation state is defined by something that can collect taxes and use those taxes to raise an army, is this fictitious currency in their view called fiat money. And the only alternative to that is gold, and gold is really inefficient for a lot of different reasons. It's for one, it's physical, but I digress. We're going to create a new form of money called Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin, its defining characteristic is going to be it serves as money, which money is a store of value, a medium of exchange, and a unit of account. It serves those functions with no government intermediary, backstopping it, facilitating it, endorsing it. And now that technology, that same technology that was designed to challenge everything that you just said, has been adapted to progress the usage of the US dollar in the form of stablecoins. So now that same technology has manifested itself as dollar stablecoins, which the current administration and many people outside of the administration, including myself, view is the defining technological tool being used to uphold the world order that you just described. And so that's why we're talking about it on this show. And it's I think one of the reasons I got into this space is that it's one of the few places where you have a confluence of all of these things manifest itself in a simple piece of technology. Geopolitics, socioeconomics, political economy, politics, and technology comes to fruition. So that's why we're here talking about it on the show. And I think a lot of the themes we're going to explore later on are going to be flavors of something that was meant to challenge what you described, then being adapted by the status quo to uphold it. And so you have the same piece of technology basically working at cross purposes. And we'll talk about Iran, and we'll talk about dollar stablecoins and how they're driving dollarization, and how other countries have responded with their own stablecoins as a way to combat dollarization, and why they'd even want to do that. And so that's why we're here talking about that today.
Yeah, it's almost like, Ian, you said this, I think, in the past 2 episodes, actually, that America's ability to innovate is actually what creates the opportunities for Americans and for our economy. And Dave just perfectly described that.
I'll tell you guys a story, and I'll have a couple of former colleagues that'll probably listen to this podcast, and they'll know what I'm talking about, but I'll keep their names out of this. So we were sitting around in 2010 having a conversation about how the U.S. Stock market was significantly overvalued at the time, at least on paper, relative to other stock markets. Well, it's obviously outperformed significantly since then. But, I was talking to a former colleague about why we had those thoughts at that time. And he said to me, well, that analysis was based on a lack of understanding around technology. So much of the dominance now since 2010 has been these large cap tech companies. I said, no, I don't think that analysis, and we made plenty of money in the decade that followed. But I said, increasingly, I realized it wasn't that analysis, or that view at the time wasn't a lack of understanding around technology. It was a lack of understanding about America. Those companies don't exist here by accident. Their being here, their being dominant here is not in spite of, it's not coincidental to, it is a product of America. America's economic system, America's cultural system, America's sociological system, Americans' spiritual system. And, I think there's always a schadenfreude, at least in my career. And maybe it's because I'm a New Yorker. So I saw 9/11, I saw the great financial crisis, I saw COVID, right? Upfront and personal in New York City. And the schadenfreude that exists from Europeans or Asians or Latin Americans or, even people from different parts of America, that it's always, this is the end of New York, or this is the end of America. But it is just a fundamental lack of, or America's too expensive. Or it's a fundamental lack of understanding about what the American engine is. And what we see here with the co-option or adoption of stable coins on these blockchain rails is not coincidental to America, just like it wasn't coincidental to America that though the market optically looked cheap in 2010 versus the rest of the world, it was never a better time to buy it versus the rest of the world, because America was once again on the dawn of another huge moment of adopting and accelerating and taking risk with technology, with the capital markets in a way that drove tremendous productivity gains, just tremendous productivity gains.
So Ian's like a max American bull. I love this. Very bullish America.
Despite whatever the political winds are of the time, I don't think you could get any different. You've never had back to back as different presidents as Biden and Trump. And I don't think that, regardless of what I think of either of them, I don't think any of the points that I made right now, it defies whichever of those gentlemen was in the White House.
I totally agree, and it will take a lot longer and a lot more poor performance, regardless of political party, to change the world order that you described. Because that world order, in my eyes, is currently backed by 22 nuclear submarines, 11 supercarriers, the GDP of the United States, its tax base. All of those things are incredibly resilient. One of the events that you mentioned, I think, is one of the defining factors in why stablecoins today have gotten the adoption they have, and it remains to be seen whether those forces will continue to accelerate it. And that was September 11th. So September 11th was a shock to the system for the world for many
Samantha, are you too young to remember where you were on September 11th?
I remember exactly where I was. I was 10 years old. I remember exactly where I was. I think anyone that was conscious outside of little babies remember where they were.
I'm older than you guys, so I've been. So where I was on September 11th was I was fresh out of college. Sorry to digress here.
No,
but I was fresh out of college. I was the newly appointed campaign fundraising manager for Catherine Freed, who was council member of the 1st District in Manhattan. She was running for public advocate of New York City, which if the mayor dies, the public advocate becomes mayor, kind of like the vice president of New York City. We were 4th or 5th in the polls, and the Democratic primary was scheduled for September 11th, 2001. So, and she, as the council member of the 1st District, had everything below Canal Street, which includes the Twin Towers. So I was with her at subway stops as she was shaking hands for people going to and from work when the first plane hit. And it was her council district.
Wow.
Sorry. I don't tell the story a lot.
No.
So there's a side note to this, though, Dave, whether this is relevant or not.
We may not take us off track. You can edit this out.
we might could edit this out. But the point...
I'll get us back on track. Don't worry.
We had a guy who came and spoke at our CXO summit, which you guys have both been to, but it was a year before you guys came. And he was our keynote. And what he studies, he has a think tank, and what they study is generational differences on how companies go to market to those generations. And one of the core things that I remember is you are actually a millennial, not based on when you were born as much, but if you very distinctly remember 9/11. So he separates generations on like their buying patterns and other things like that, their consumer behavior, based on key events that kind of shape your view of the world.
Where we went moon landing, Kennedy shot.
It changed everything, and one of the things that it changed.
So let's put it back on track. So Dave, you were saying about 9/11.
Yeah, I'm going to explain this. I'm going to explain this. Yeah, one of the primary things it changed financial regulation. So the same way that, and it changed financial regulation not from a market structure perspective, but from a anti-money laundering and CFT, which is combating the financing of terrorism perspective. The same way my parents say, before 9/11, I used to be able to walk into an airport and get on the plane and there's no, scanners and all this shit. And then afterwards, it's like really heavy duty. That same transition happened in the financial system. So we put up a lot of airport scanners and body scanners and x-ray machines in the financial system. And that made it increasingly difficult for people outside of the United States or on the fringes of the US endorsed or policed financial system to interact with US dollars by design, because we were worried that the dollar, being such a powerful tool, would be used by rogue states and non-state actors, i.e. terrorists, to perpetuate another 9/11. And so stablecoins have found product market fit in emerging markets precisely because they are so accessible. Because anyone with an internet connection can now save, spend, send, receive, and earn in dollars. And they sit outside to some extent, not entirely, because stablecoins are still backed by U.S. Treasuries, and they still do operate under the graces of the government, whether it's implicit or explicit, like Genius in the instance of Genius sponsored stablecoins or Genius approved stablecoins. But that event changed society in a way that directly gave rise to the product market fit for stablecoins in emerging markets, because they made it easier to interact with the dollar. And a lot of the reasons it wasn't easy was directly the response to September 11th. And so just to highlight that, because I think that is an event. Yeah, it's an event that really, why? So stablecoins started as a way to trade in crypto. Why was that the case? Because crypto companies couldn't get bank accounts. Why was that the case? Because a lot of the AML and CFT regulations that were put in place, the government has given the banks completely devolved power for enforcing. It's one of the only places where the government has put in place a law and they didn't say the police are going to enforce that, or this body is going to be responsible for upholding it. They said, no, these banks, these privately owned companies, you're responsible for enforcing these Patriot Act regulations and making sure that Al-Qaeda does not get dollars and can't use those dollars to build car bombs and stuff like that, right? So even going all the way back to, and crypto was, obviously Bitcoin was a response to the GFC, but I think a lot of the malaise around the way the financial system was working, and even fast forward to today with Iran and China and Russia, is from the teeth that the United States put in the dollar as a direct response to September 11th.
100%. And the unintended consequences, irony, rears itself again. And we'll see unintended consequences coming out of Iran, but it's consistent with a really big theme of decentralization, of more and more people having more and more internet connectivity, becoming more and more part of the global community, wanting more and more of that access, and as a function of definition, that technology, being able to achieve that access, and people seeking out their own free will through technology. And that's just it's a huge theme. And so we can put up these barriers and we can do these things, but technology itself gets a vote in the battle for individual freedom, and it's a big vote.
And I think
and the U.S. government accepting and acknowledging that vote that technology gets, I think it's been very liberating, for the Web3 industry, for the crypto industry in the past year.
And the biggest change, going back to the politics of our country, from our perspective in this crypto finance ocean that we live in, between the prior administration and this administration, is they've gone from trying to make stablecoins and crypto illegal to embracing it as a tool to advance a lot of the geopolitical interests that you discussed in your initial monologue. And I think at some point today we should talk about if that's a good thing or a bad thing. And preview the answer, I think it depends, right? We have, and we'll talk about Iran and the Strait of Hormuz, which has become a crypto toll booth, literally. And you have that, but then you also have hundreds of millions of people now who are saving in dollars, investing in dollars, and really stable coins in that use case are essentially entrenching future demand for US dollars and all of the interests of the United States that indirectly sort of persists. So at some point today, we got to talk about whether or not that's a good or a bad thing.
I want to make a little point about stablecoin issuers of US dollars in the US system under US law. So why do stablecoins work? They work because ultimately you could redeem your stablecoin for fiat, right? If you couldn't redeem your stablecoin for fiat, if that redemption window didn't exist, stablecoins themselves would not maintain their value. So you could redeem your USDC or sell or send it to somebody else who could redeem it. And they can get fiat. And they can pay their taxes in fiat, right? At the most basic level. Everybody doesn't need to be able to redeem their USDC or their Tether or anything else. But at some point, someone somewhere can redeem and get dollars in a dollar bank account. And that means that they can be part of the very large US economy. Okay. I want to make a comment here about the rule of law. Let's say you had a Chinese stablecoin issuer. Do I trust that a US stablecoin issuer that's abiding by the law is going to be able to make those redemptions? And how do I view that comparatively if there was a stablecoin issuer under Chinese law? A judiciary that's far less open, a judiciary that doesn't have to respond to any kind of democratic political influence, in an economy with a closed capital account, so they're used to shutting off people's ability to take their money out of the system. The US system itself at its core, though it bends once in a while and we can complain about this lawfare or that lawfare, basically works. The US judiciary is pretty darn good. And US companies operate, and now Genius Act compliant companies operate under US law. And I think that's an important part of why people around the world can trust their issuance, because they exist under a legal framework that has the integrity to allow them to operate their businesses independently of that government influence. Yes. Is the FBI going to get a FISA warrant if a terrorist is using USDC? Sure. But is the government going to shut down Circle because they don't like Circle's management team, even though the management team hasn't broken any laws? Or are they going to shut down Anchorage's stablecoin because that management team may not agree with their politics? Or are they going to shut down Paxos? Are they going to shut down even Tether or any of these things? No. The government does not have the capacity here to shut down these private enterprises the way that governments in other countries can and do. And even here, there's an aspect of the US system that's important. Now, are there things on the margin? Could we be overusing FISA courts? Could we be pushing too hard on OFAC regulations? Could we be scaring people about how strong the federal government gets? Yes, but those are marginal relative to the main event, which is most of the time, most of us trust most US companies to be traded fairly in most US courts.
Before I say what I'm going to say just for the record, I entirely agree with you, but that's because I exist in the paradigm that you do. And what does that mean? What do I mean by that? One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. And so our perspective on trust in that system depends entirely on where we sit. What I mean by that is your trust in the US system not weaponizing the dollar against you would be very different if you were sitting in Palestine or Iran or China or in Russia, right? Where we do often and frequently use those same financial regulations and those executive powers we discussed to weaponize the dollar against other people. Iran's economy right now is in a dire state because the US government was able to cut it off from the financial system because the control it exerts over the US dollar, and any bank and any financial provider that touches US dollars, period. Right? So what you're saying is like we trust that much more than we do the CCP and the yuan issue, the yuan-backed stablecoin. But that's because we exist in this on this side of the argument.
I will push back. Number one, I'm not in favor of that cultural relativism argument. I think objectively, the Chinese economy is more closed than the U.S. economy.
Sure.
Objectively, the Chinese judiciary, does not support open society values the way that the U.S. judiciary does. Objectively,
and
now,
they don't think they're wrong. That's the thing. Is like
they might not think that they're wrong, but any objective analysis would have to agree that they are more closed, that they are more capricious, and that their rule of law is more heavily influenced by the body politic. In fact, it's written into their constitution.
Your implication is that's a bad thing, though, just to be clear. Your implication is that's a bad thing.
I'm making the objective argument that we're more open, they're more closed. Which one is better? They could think that it's better to be more closed, but they can't argue that they're more open. So objectively, they're more closed, we're more open, I think, by any standards. Now, whether or not that serves a greater social good, we can argue, Chinese and American leaders can argue about who's got the better system. But objectively, one is more closed, one is more open. To the point that you make about our perspective, you're absolutely right. But the US dollar and the US system provides a big social good around the world. And if you want to be part of that system and you want to benefit from that, then you have to play by our rules. Nobody's making you play by these rules. But if you're like, let's put it this way. If you're an Iranian regime member smuggling oil and you're holding your dollars in an Emirati bank, why'd you hold your savings in dollars? There were other choices. So don't evade U.S. Look, I think we overuse U.S. sanctions. Okay, I think as a general matter, it's a very easy tool for presidents to use because it doesn't put boots on the ground, and it does every time we do it. It's powerful, and every time we do it, it reduces out the hooks that our system has into the rest of the world, which provide a lot of value. So we overuse it. Doesn't mean we shouldn't use it, but we do overuse it on the margin. And by the way, this administration, Bessent can find examples. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, can easily find examples of it being overused in other administrations, and former leaders in other administrations can certainly point to him overusing it now. So everybody can agree it gets a little bit overused on the margin. But there's a bigger point here, which is we as taxpaying US Americans do not owe our system as a charity to be given to the rest of the world as if that's their right to benefit from that which we have built. If you are, if a Yemeni Houthi who's making your money selling rockets and shooting at U.S. cargo ships with those rockets, and you choose to hold your money in dollars whilst behaving in that way, we don't just owe you the right to keep your savings in our currency while you're doing things that hurt American strength and by definition hurt that same currency. So we don't owe it to these people to let them play in this game. That is not their right. And it is our right to decide who gets to play in the game. Now, if we're magnanimous about it, as we historically have been, and we find ways to be even more intelligent about it, as we are with stablecoins, that's to our benefit and to everybody else's in a free and open society. But I don't think we owe it to them to protect their right to injure the system that we have created to the benefit of not just Americans, but everybody.
I agree with you. I'm simply making the point that there's a reason why we're even talking about de-dollarization. And a lot of that reason is because parties that don't share the same view that we do recognize that weaponization as a threat to them. And it's in their interest to remove themselves from that system because it removes a key piece of leverage over, in their eyes, an enemy has over them.
Right. But that gets back to the point I think that we started today, which is, okay, so you don't like us to a degree where you're working for the Iranian regime, but yet you still hold your savings in dollars. So tell riddle me this. What does that tell you about their perception of their own alternatives when their own children's savings is on the line. So they down death to America, but let me hold American dollars. It's sort of like, it's sort of like gays for Hamas. It's a little bit like, what are we talking about here? The paradox here is rich, and it does speak to the lack of alternatives that exist and have historically. And I think that, let me change topics a little bit for a second. So I think that right now in the Middle East, we need to ask the question about whether or not some of the biggest holders of US treasuries and thus US dollars, our allied Gulf states, will hold less treasuries as a function of us, as a function of the Iran war, and as a function of us retrenching from the region. And I think that they are a big enough holder that if they were to exit, it would be impactful. I don't think that they will, but it's clearly the case that this is the biggest pivot in U.S. Middle East policy we have ever seen, at least since the Iraq War, but maybe since then, and maybe including then. And I think that that's a fair debate. And I think to the point you're making, do they see themselves as inside the U.S. system and on Team America? Or do they see themselves outside the U.S. system and on Team America? And I'm thinking here about the Emiratis and the Saudis as like a great example of that. They've been great U.S. allies. We have bases there. They're huge holders of dollars. Like, one of the questions to ask if we're really worried about de-dollarization as a function of Iran is, will the Saudis and the Emiratis hold less dollars in the next 5 years, or have less of an allocation of their savings to dollars than they did in the last 5 years? If the answer to that's yes, then it's a big deal. You think there's no way?
No. I think they're unhappy the way in which the conflict started. But I think their position now is, all right, you started it, now you got to finish it. Like, they are not in any way happy with the state of affairs before or especially now in the context of Iran and the threat that it posed to their continued existence and their economic order. And so I think that in order for them to continue a state of affairs which is very beneficial to the leadership of those countries, which is those countries, right? They're not necessarily the most democratic or open societies. Depends entirely on American aircraft carriers and Patriot missiles and the continued engagement of the United States in the Middle East. And I think for them to make the decision of we're going to dump dollars and we're going to dump treasuries and we're going to decouple is the opposite of what they want. It will have the outcome of that will be the opposite of what they want, which is the continued shield of the United States to protect them and allow their
even if it's a reduced presence in the Middle East, they'd still pay the same price for 50% presence, because 50% presence is better than 0% presence.
There's no alternative. That's your point earlier, right? There's absolutely no alternative. Like, there is no China does not have the capability to do what the United States is doing in the region. Europe certainly does. I mean, Europe will have to make it's like Europe has to make the same decision that the United States. It's either free healthcare or B-2 bombers. I know that's facetious, but like Europe, I just lived in London for the last 7 years, right? The deficits they run fund social programs and safety nets and free healthcare, and they're not in any state. Whereas our deficits fund $1 trillion the Department of Defense budgets, right? And so they're not in any state to do that. And so I do not see a world where the Middle East, I think that this war probably actually drives our interests closer, and actually probably drives the interests of the Middle East and Israel closer to a large extent, which is a really interesting outcome.
If Israel and the Lebanese do a peace deal, which seems to be on the table in the next couple of weeks, I mean, it'll be a pretty spectacular thing for the region and for the world. It's certainly something I'm keeping a close eye on.
So, guys,
to your point, I mean,
yeah, go ahead, Sam. Bring us back to.
You're gonna have to edit the bejesus out of this thing.
No, it's great, you guys. This is the point. But I do want to hit on something else that we started to hit on, and then we went down this rabbit hole, which
I do want to talk about risks to the U.S. dollar and to U.S. dominance, and at some point,
let's do that. Let's talk about this first, this kind of tension. What I want y'all to debate or discuss right now is this tension between stablecoins as a tool for dollar dominance, but also we hit on some other things. Stablecoins can also be a tool for people to evade sanctions, or for people who typically have been cut out of the US dollar system to now use US dollars. And so that is a tension. How do you think about that tension, and what should the US be doing about it, if anything?
Well, when the cartels get excuse me, when the cartels get raided in Mexico and they open up a cartel leader's mansion, what's the thing they find?
Dollars. I don't know. I've never been inside one.
I've seen Narcos. They see dollars buried underneath.
They see dollars.
Sicario. All this equals. Well, it appears to me that the thing that they find the most, at least in the movies, is bundles and bundles of US dollar cash.
Yeah.
So just because people were holding in US dollar cash, or they're holding in stables, in fact, for the average person trying to protect them against their own country's profligacy, and feel that the US government's profligacy is less, and thus they'd rather hold dollars, stablecoins actually make it more available to them. It's harder for them to hold tons and tons of cash. It's not very secure unless you've got armed guards protecting that cash. But for the average saver, for the average student, for the average pensioner, in the average place that's trying to protect against inflation that's greater than in the United States, stablecoins are actually a leveling factor to enable those people. Bad actors want dollars anyway. They're holding them in bundles of cash, protected with armed guards.
It's a good point.
Need that.
Dave, I know you feel very passionate about the argument people try to make that stablecoins are an enabler of crime versus the other. So maybe this is your moment.
Well, to Ian's point, look, when they bust cartel leaders or kingpins or roadside bomb makers, they find US dollars, right? They don't find crypto and stable coins. And I think that the narrative that, yes, some bad actors have used stable coins to evade sanctions is wildly overblown, and that we can't deal in a society of absolutes. We have to look at sort of the magnitude of that illicit behavior and balance that against the benefits of a global, frictionless, free US dollar. And the magnitude of the illicit activity happening with stablecoins is empirically orders of magnitude lower than the amount of illicit activity being facilitated by the existing banking system, period. I mean, not 2 years goes by without a large GSIB getting a multi-billion-dollar fine for some multi-billion-dollar money laundering scheme that bank typically knew about and was facilitating because they made fees on those transactions or lending those people money or accepting their deposits. And so if someone is going to make the argument that stablecoins are bad because a very small fraction of their usage does facilitate bad things, then we need to shut down the banking system. We need to outlaw cash. We need to go to I don't know there is no alternative. There is no alternative. Whenever you have something, the US dollar is a piece of technology, just like stablecoins are. Stablecoins are an extension of that technology, and they've made it digital and internet native. There's always going to be people that use it for the wrong purposes, whether that's artificial intelligence or the internet. The internet's perpetuated so much scams and so much fraud. Artificial intelligence has perpetuated so much misinformation and malaise and but no one's saying let's outlaw those things. People say let's regulate them and let's police them, and that's exactly what the United States has done with the Genius Act. They've said, you know what, on the balance, stable coins are incredibly good for a lot of different reasons for a lot of different people and a lot of different businesses. We do need some rules to prevent complete lawlessness, and we've put those in place now. And so, but there is definitely a strand within the US government that doesn't agree with anything that I'm saying, right? I mean, Elizabeth Warren in the Biden administration, her campaign was run on let's raise an anti-crypto army, and definitely wrapped in to her views was stablecoins, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, but I find that patently ridiculous. I don't think anyone can actually back it up.
you know, it's almost as ridiculous as Bernie Sanders' comments that we should shut down the building of data centers. I mean, number one, it's not feasible. Number two, it's inconsistent with having a free society. And number three, it's really, really bad as an idea. And we're not, as a country, going to decelerate ourselves. It's too inconsistent with who we are, even though we acknowledge that freedom isn't free. There are costs to our freedom. Like, okay, we accept that. We accept that to a greater degree than they do in China and Europe and elsewhere. And that's just that's part of understanding the American machine, is that we accept that freedom is not free, and we are willing to pay more for that freedom.
I think the question, yeah, I agree. And I think the question that we probably, the discussion we probably should be happening, not we in this call, but in the government, is do existing sort of financial regulations actually work at all? Like the amount of money and time that goes into enforcing those Patriot Act induced financial regulations when it comes to AML and CFT and KYC is astronomical. And the actual effectiveness of them is very low, right? I think it's less, don't quote me on this, but I do think it is, we need to ask ChatGPT, but I believe it's on the order of like 1% to 2% of like criminal proceeds and money laundering that's actually detected and stopped through the effort of hundreds of billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of people that exist solely to uphold and prevent that activity. And stablecoins' role in that is infinitesimal. It is so, and so the question we really should be asking is, what are all the downsides that we have? What are all the symptoms or the side effects of that regime that we've put in place? You've got over 1 billion people that don't have bank accounts on the planet, right? You have a lot of crony, corrupt banks who have been given a license to operate primarily in emerging markets that prevent those individuals and those businesses from saving for retirement, from going to saving for tuition for college, for having savings to buy food, right? And a lot of that, so it's like stablecoins provide an alternative to get people out of that. And so the argument that they're going to somehow weaken what is already a broken system that has terrible side effects that I think far outweigh the benefits that they put in place is, to me, just patently ridiculous. And I think it's lost. That argument lost, right? Which is good. It lost. Like, Genius Act is in place. Stablecoins continue to grow. They continue to proliferate. Secretary of Treasury is one of their biggest fans. Luckily. So I think that's the good thing.
And worth noting that Genius Act was bipartisan, right?
It
so
was.
Even though, yeah.
Well, and the reason for that, thank God, is because we didn't get money out of politics. Because we did not get money out of politics, enough money was made in crypto that could go into the lobbying efforts to pass these laws. It turns out maybe the Supreme Court was right. This is about the most politically incorrect thing I can say. Maybe they were right that money is speech. Maybe the Supreme Court was correct that money in a free society is speech, and that corporates maybe can spend money to effectuate political outcome. Maybe the money that was made in crypto resulted in lobbying efforts that changed the law to be more consistent with American freedom.
Those lobbying efforts, though, they are bipartisan and they backfired big time. They gave rise to the anti-crypto army. So, quick history lesson: Sam Bankman-Fried, for those of you who don't know, the founder and CEO of FTX, which was he was the biggest donor to the Democratic Party in the Biden candidacy.
But at its core, we have a very open campaign finance system in America. We have one that's so open and reinforced by the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court said spending money is protected by free speech. Hugely controversial. I'm not saying whose speech money is protected by or it's tantamount to. So when you had this crypto industry on a bipartisan basis contribute money to both parties, both Republican and Democrat, and both parties agreed to pass the Genius Act, what I wonder to myself is, well, maybe if the Supreme Court doesn't uphold political spending as a form of speech, then we'd have less freedom potentially in lobbying. And maybe if we had less freedom in lobbying, the entrenched interests, like the large banks, would have been able to forestall the adoption of this legislation for another 5, 10, 20 years. It's entirely possible that freedom begets freedom and freedom begets better outcomes. So one of the most controversial things that's taken place that the Supreme Court has done was say that political campaign spending is protected by free speech. And I think there's a good argument to be made that had that not been upheld, entrenched existing interests would have been better able to box out the bipartisan lobbying and thus the bipartisan passage of this crypto legislation.
But that's also because the bank lobby has so much money coming in too,
which
is why we needed the money.
But freedom is always about challenging entrenched interests. Do you believe that if we wrestled down campaign spending, the banks would be any less powerful? No, it's the opening up of this and the protection of these freedoms that allow entrenched powers to be challenged. Entrenched powers are powerful. That's why they're entrenched powers. Freedom is what allows things at the margin to challenge those entrenched powers. And codifying that freedom, as distasteful and politically incorrect as it may be, I think is a big unsung hero of this bipartisan crypto legislation.
You know, Ian, this is actually a good point, thinking about entrenched powers. For us to go back to the dollar and the global dominance of the dollar, right? We are the entrenched power. But we haven't talked about the risks.
Yeah,
and you mentioned that earlier, and I think it's worth us probably closing the episode on the risks still presented.
I'd love to. So one of the biggest entrenched powers in the United States, and the place where I'm most worried about the U.S. economy and its competitiveness, is around energy. There's a tremendous amount of lobbying that still exists from the oil and petrochemical industry, and that independence in natural gas and oil has been phenomenal and made the U.S. economy resilient here. But it's actually not going to be the dominant energy of the future. The dominant energy of the future is going to be solar and battery. That is not an article of faith. That is not an article of politics or green environmentalism. It is an article of physics. The dominant energy in the world will be solar and battery. And solar and battery are huge contributors to China growing its generation capacity. Now, China burns a lot of coal. I'm not making an environmental argument here. But Chinese dominance in battery and solar, which will be the dominant, cheap, ubiquitous energy of the future, is a problem for American competitiveness in AI, which will be the dominant driving force of the global economy for the rest of my life. We do not have any notable domestic capacity to build industrial battery and no large-scale solar getting us anywhere where we need to be. And the entrenched interests around the existing energy infrastructure in America are a big part of that. The entrenched interests and lobbying around nuclear are a big part of that, and everybody's very excited. But there is no energy source that is more important for us to build than solar and battery. And if we are not the low-cost, dominant player in a technology that we invented, it will significantly hamper whether or not American shores are the place where global data centers live. And if the data centers aren't within your boundaries, protected by your army, then you do not control the future of artificial intelligence. Does not matter if we make the chips here. Does not matter if we write the code here. If the data centers themselves are living in China, protected by the People's Liberation Army, because they are the dominant low-cost producer of electricity, then the America of the future that is so dominant in frontier technology right now will be significantly hampered. We have to be the low-cost producer of electricity. There's only one technology that does that. That technology is solar and battery, and we are so far behind where we need to be. And because we are behind where we need to be, we will be behind where we need to be in AI. And if we are behind where we need to be in AI, we will be behind where we need to be in drones and robotics and everything else that comes with it. It is why Musk is talking about putting solar in outer space. That, while super cool and interesting, as he has said himself, would not be a conversation if he was able to build solar and battery here, as he's tried to for quite some time. We need 1, 2, 3 terawatts of electrical generative capacity in the United States in the next 5 years, and we need it in general, but the best and smartest and cheapest way to do it is solar and battery, and we are nowhere on this. And if we are not dominant, sorry, just to finish the thought, if we are not dominant, or at least competitive, in having ubiquitous, abundant solar and battery electrification in the United States, the data centers won't live here. If the data centers don't live here, we will not control the AI future. And that means we don't control the future of robotics or drones or many other things.
And you think that risk, which I agree with, by the way, is the biggest risk to continued US dollar dominance?
Yeah, because I think the US dollar dominance is a function of US technological dominance. And I think the technology of the future is AI, and it uses power, and we don't have enough power, and we don't have the right power.
I'm not yet convinced that AI is that powerful. I'm not convinced. I do see a world where it can be, but I'm not yet convinced that.
I tell you what convinced me?
What?
My Tesla full self-driving.
Oh, just because your car can drive itself doesn't flip to.
My car can drive itself.
That's a parlor trick. That's a parlor trick.
Drive itself.
Yeah. Because I think that potentially if AI does become as powerful as you say, you imply by your logic chain, which is we don't control the energy, we don't control the data centers, we don't control AI, US dollar dies, right? I know you're not leaping all the way to there, but the implicit I think assumption is that's such an important thing to control.
The intervening variable is that it's not our military. Whilst our military dominance is an important part of our dollar dominance, that's a function of our technological dominance.
Agreed.
So in the future, where drones are more important, then coordinated drones require AI. And coordinated drones that require AI require being the dominant player in AI, and that requires having the AI. And what does it mean to have AI? It means the physical data center taking the physical power from your physical land that you can physically control.
Do you not think that, okay, so we're talking about the application of artificial intelligence in military power and force, which I do definitely buy as something that could change the world order in such a way that definitely one of the outcomes could be a change in the world's reserve currency. But don't you think if we ever got to that point that we would, like we did in 1941 to 1945, kick our industrial economy into overdrive and start building those data centers and those batteries?
You're right. So I'd make that argument, but I am terrified that we have not begun the Manhattan Project yet for solar and battery. And we are late for where we need to be for terawatt production by 2030. We are already running late, and there are no signs that we are getting the joke on solar and battery. There is nobody getting that joke. Like, nobody seems to care anywhere. And there are corporates who get it. Anybody who's taken, anybody who's looked at this understands that solar and battery are the dominant technology. If you do away with all of the non-physics issues, permitting or this or that, like when you do with all the stuff, when you just say what should be the dominant technology, it should be this. And there is no Manhattan Project to make this happen. And there's not enough. And the corporates in America, the multi-trillion-dollar market cap companies, are not out there building the battery factories. Michael Dell's son is doing something in Texas. There's a little bit on the margin, but you need terawatts. US produces 5 terawatts of power. China's gone from 5 to 10, as everybody's seen this chart in the last 5-10 years. We need a few more terawatts, and it should all come from battery and solar, and we are literally nowhere on this.
I will say, being on the ground in Texas right now, everywhere you drive, new solar fields are being built. And that's because data centers are trying to build here.
You need the batteries. Solar is cheap. You need the batteries. Why is China dominant in battery? I will explain. Shall we digress for a moment here, or are we far off the topic?
Go for it, and we'll decide what to do with it.
Okay. So Chinese battery producers like cattle are their input to their battery production is heavily subsidized by the government. So think rare earths, think the other materials that go into industrial battery production. And so it's been cheap for them to scale and do this. So from a upstream perspective, they've been subsidized to get huge scale. That's created a downstream advantage for Chinese autos. Namely, they're so much cheaper than autos anywhere else because the batteries that go into the Chinese EVs are subsidized because cattle can sell them cheaper. So they've got a whole vertically integrated supply chain around battery that just does not exist in the US economy at all. And if it wasn't going to be the dominant low-cost energy source of the future, it wouldn't really matter. If it was on par with natural gas, that'd be great. We have tons of natural gas. But it's so obviously dominant.
Why is that the case, though? Like, let me play out your scenario where AI is the next Manhattan Project outcome. I
don't think it's AI. I think it's power. We've already got the AI. The AI is here. We just need the power.
But the implication is that the power enables the AI, and control of the AI is what could turn the scales of there being a relative alternative to the US dollar and et cetera, et cetera.
Well, because it threatens US technology dominance. I want to just insist that the only reason I'm saying it is so much of US dominance is a function of US technological dominance. And if AI is the dominant technology and you don't control that, then you lose a big underpinning of US dollar dominance.
I see what you mean. So you're saying that the world's biggest, most valuable companies won't be built in the United States, and by implication, the US won't have that tax revenue and the GDP.
Even if they're built here, even if it's Meta, but Meta's got its data centers in, I won't say China. Let's say they've got them in Greenland, and we don't control Greenland. Let's say they've got them in Kenya, and we don't control Kenya. If the data centers are not in the United States, then they are a security risk. If so much of technology and productivity and value creation is physically sitting outside of the United States, even if nominally owned by US corporates, I think that is problematic for the projection of power and technological dominance writ large.
And the implication is then that
then without that technological dominance, ultimately innovation is stymied on a relative basis. Ultimately, the security interests are stymied. Ultimately, the US will have to extend itself militarily in ways that could make it vulnerable. Ultimately, we are now opening up an attack vector because the most important part of technological dominance and thus the global economy is not something that we can easily protect.
How do we prevent that then? So in terms of
large scale battery factories in America, solar cells are cheap as chips and get cheaper every day. But solar without battery does not work. It's the combination of the two. We do not have large scale industrial battery production in the United States at all.
Why
Not
not?
like a little bit, not like it's getting going, not like it's all coming online next year. None, zero,
Why
zilch.
not? Why is that?
Because we've had really entrenched power interests in the United States. Natural gas has grown a tremendous amount in dominance, and that's powered a lot of electrification. And natural gas is cheap and abundant, but it's not as cheap and abundant as sunlight. Sunlight's a lot more cheap and abundant. It just is.
What's wrong with nuclear?
Nuclear is just really expensive to build at scale. It's hard. It doesn't have the scaling properties. To get large scale power generation, you need scale. And it's very hard to build a very large nuclear reactor. Look, if it was really cheap, yes, you could do it, but it takes a long time. It's one of those things that sounds great on paper. In theory, nuclear would be wonderful, but if it takes you 5 years to build a large scale nuclear factory, but for the same amount of power, it could take you 12 months to have solar and battery. And we're in the middle of an AI race for electrification right now. Nuclear is good in theory, but it's not what it's going to take to win in the next few years, which is where we need to be to not lose our position of dominance. In theory, it could work. In reality, you need scale. You need these scaling properties that come with this new energy system. And that's just solar and battery. There's not like a close number two.
It's a compelling argument. And the implication is for the dollar that in that world.
Imagine if just a massive share of global corporate AI goes where people go to low-cost producers of power, and those low-cost producers of the power are sitting in China or somewhere else, and those data centers are not sitting here. Then fast forward this whole conversation we're having with China over trade and rare earths. Okay, problematic, right? Well, wait until you're asking your doctor what your diagnosis should be, and your AI doctor's data centers in China, and then they're saying, hey, we'll shut that off if this trade negotiation doesn't go the right way. Like, we're talking about magnets and rare earths. Imagine when we're saying that about human intelligence, and it's powering robots and knowledge work and drones and everything else. And to put those facilities there gives them the leverage that they do over rare earths. And that's why the Chinese are so big on open source models. Because they've realized, great, give everybody open source models. We'll be the low cost producer of electricity. So we'll take our dominance by having the data center here. And there's one way, and we know how to solve this, and we can, and we are not. And to get to your point about entrenched interests and risks, if technological dominance is the most important thing behind U.S. dollar dominance, because obviously feeds into military dominance and cultural dominance, then we need to stay dominant in technology, and the dominant technology is AI, and that requires power, and power requires solar and battery.
We do need an entire episode about AI, but we just spent 15 minutes on it here. So nice teaser for our AI episode. Dave, what do you think? What do you think the risk is? And then let's go to close.
I mean, I didn't think of the risks as explicitly as Ian just laid them out. I think he may have convinced me that those are the biggest risks. But I'll add another one. I think I do. Let me add another one that feeds into the core of what Ian's saying, which is technological dominance and the impacts that has on the American economy and thus the position of the US dollar. Brains. So for as long as the United States remains the country where the smartest people in the world want to live and build businesses, to me, that is also incredibly important in driving the outcomes that Ian's talking about, which upholds the continued dominance of the US dollar. And it's literally like, if you look at, I don't know what percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs, but many of them are first generation or second generation immigrants who we continue to attract the best and the brightest in the world who come on our shores to build the best and the brightest and the biggest companies in the world. And so I think I look at it less from the terawatts and more. We're saying basically the same thing, but the concern I'd add is terawatts, yes, raw output, yes, but the brains that actually make that happen and build those companies on those fundamental technologies that then are used, they monetize them and build services, and the Palmer Luckies of the world and the Elon Musks of the world, and these really just sharp people that are building these things. I think that just raw intellectual power needs to continue to find its home in the United States. And I think the day that that's no longer the case, the outcome of that is potentially the U.S. dollar no longer being the dominant currency in this world.
And we need to, I completely agree. And we need to do a better job of educating our own homegrown brains as well. We have plenty of we should take in the best human capital from around the world, but we should also make sure that the human capital, which is natively here, is also educated to the greatest extent possible. Maybe that's a four-year college, maybe it's not. There's a million ways to define education, but we need to make sure that we are intellectually, we are facilitating the intellectual growth of the next generation to remain technologically dominant.
So in summary, we talked about a lot today, but it can all be wrapped up into how blockchain and stablecoins and somewhat Bitcoin, which we hit on but didn't go deep on, how that is part of very much entrenched in what is happening geopolitically right now. And so let's just spend, 1 or 2 minutes each talking about what we're watching relative to that topic or stablecoin adoption in general. I'm happy to go first if you guys want me to.
Go for it.
So the current state of the world right now, as it exists, is, and most of our conversations around stablecoins are anyone, anywhere with an internet connection can save in US dollars, right? And so now what I think about is what is the next state of the world? And when we think about agentic commerce, and when we think about the way people are going to start transacting, I think this is going to become much more global and borderless because of the agentic commerce, all enabled because of the seamless payments that you can now do through stablecoins. And so when I think about the adoption of stablecoins over the next decade, I'm thinking much farther beyond just holding US dollars and saving in US dollars and getting yield in US dollars. I'm thinking about how does the global economy really start to do every single microtransaction potentially in US dollar stablecoins. And if that's a reality, then this is even so much bigger than what I think a lot of people are projecting right now.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. I mean, one thing that we didn't cover today is agentic commerce, which is, well, I'm sure we'll get to in another episode. I think that could be a massive accelerant for stablecoins, and it will be a massive accelerant for stablecoins. On the topic of geopolitics and de-dollarization, I'm looking to see whether the Abraham Accords hold up in Saudi-Israeli relations. I think if that holds up on the back of this, whatever this is, that'll be good, and it will have U.S. allies triangulate to be closer with each other. It'll make it easier for the U.S. to manage the region. So I think that's incredibly important. I think the jury's out, but I'm hopeful. It would be great to see Saudi rebuild Gaza. It would be great to see an Israeli-Lebanese peace deal. It's good to see that the Houthis in Yemen have not been a huge issue so far. I certainly don't want to see boots on the ground in Iran. If this resolves quickly, there'll be plenty of time to in front of the midterm elections, and hopefully we'll get more moderates in Congress and that are more pro technology, and that'll be really important. If we take the current Middle Eastern situation off the table, we can focus more on domestic issues. We can focus more on setting ourselves up for success. What is a very quickly accelerating technological environment.
I'm watching all the things now because of what you guys said. And I'm especially now going to be focused on our ability to create solar power capacity in the US. Thank you, Ian. I'm now going to be paranoid about our battery and solar capacity. The thing I'm watching...
It's a scary rabbit hole when you go down it.
Yeah, I wish you would have never told me. I just live in my my natural gas powered house and I'm going to be fat and happy until one day I'm not. The thing I'm watching with regards to the themes we spoke about today is stablecoin adoption outside the United States. Because I think that is as much a barometer of product market fit for technology as it is product market fit for the US dollar. I think that they go hand in hand. Like, people aren't going to be adopting dollar stablecoins, just because they're also adopting the dollar when they do that, right? They're adopting stablecoins, which is the new form factor of the US dollar, but they're also adopting the dollar as a form of currency, regardless of the form in which it takes. And so that adoption to me is a great barometer of the demand and appetite for US dollars abroad and its continued dominance.
Yeah, 100%.